With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. Coming up later, new concerns over spotted lanternfly after discovery at the border. We'll have details. But our top story today, both sides of the Senate Ag Committee leadership have now shared their visions for the next Farm Bill. Chad Smith has more on the legislation's progress.
Senate Ag Committee Chair Debbie Stabenow and Ranking Member John Bozeman have now both offered outlines of the Farm Bill for consideration. Joby Young, the Executive Vice President of the American Farm Bureau Federation, talks about key provisions in the proposals.
What we're seeing in the proposals that are coming out from all of our leaders on the Ag Committee that's important to us at Farm Bureau and certainly across the ag world is the broad recognition that the ag provisions of the Farm Bill do need some updates, like looking at our ag programs and updating pieces of that to meet the economic changes we've seen over the last few years. The value of crop insurance and finding ways to improve and expand crop insurance are some of the commonalities.
Bozeman and Stabenow's overviews do have key differences, though. Some
key differences that are going to define the debate going forward are primarily in places like the nutrition title and what the proposals are that the different leaders have. Another piece is what the conservation programs look like going forward. They've made a lot of progress in the last few months moving closer together on conservation, but there's still a little bit of pencil sharpening left to go to have some final agreement on that piece.
Young says the proposals are an important step. More progress needs to be made.
Well, what we're hoping for is now that Chairwoman Stabenow and Ranking Member Bozeman both have proposals out there that are summaries, that we'll see bill text and we'll see a markup schedule, and they'll take what they put here in sort of outline format and memorialize it and formalize it into bill text so they can go and have a hearing and have a markup and pass the Farm Bill on the Senate side.
Go to fb.org to keep up with the latest Farm Bill developments. Chad Smith, Washington.
Crop growers have until mid-July to report acreage planted this year at their local Farm Service Agency office. Rod Bain tells us why that's important.
An important deadline for growers of most spring planted crops is soon approaching.
July 15th is very critical. We stress and emphasize as soon as those crops are planted that they should come in, report their crop acreage that they're intending to plant, and to ensure that they are on file with the FSA office.
Why, according to Farm Service Agency Assistant Deputy Administrator Kim Graham, is acreage reporting is an eligibility requirement for several USDA programs. One caveat, though.
The date can vary by crop and by county, but the majority of those crops and the deadline date is July 15th.
She also provides this tip for reporting producers.
A producer with perennial forage crops have the ability or the option to report their acreage once
if there are no notable changes on their farm. So when they come into their local FSA office to report acreage,
that will allow for their acreage reports to roll over from year to year.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Experts are watching closely as new leadership prepares to take the helm in Mexico after the nation elected Claudia Sheinbaum as president. C.J. Miller has more.
Yes, I know I'm optimistic, but I hope one way or the other that corn decree and some other things might see a change.
And that's Ted McKinney, CEO of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Given Sheinbaum's science background as a research engineer, he says he's optimistic that she'll overturn the previous decree that was put into place by current President Obrador that bans the import of U.S. biotech white corn for human consumption.
The way to get there could be varied. For example, it may be that before she makes any decision to overturn such a decree, the results of the USMCA dispute agreement come out and say or rule it's inappropriate, and she just lets that stand. So she may or may not have to make a reversal of the decree, but either way, no matter how you vector into this, the result absolutely must be a change in that policy.
McKinney says he's also optimistic that Sheinbaum will agree to increase Mexico's funding for research and preventative measures to keep harmful animal diseases such as African swine fever from rearing its ugly head.
We know that there had been a substantial reduction in funding for their regulatory agencies looking after invasive species and various diseases that could, without losing some care, find their way to the U.S. We're hoping that science background is applied in good fashion and we get some things fixed.
Most of all, McKinney says it's very important that the U.S. and Mexico maintain their strong ag trade partnership.
Oh my goodness, yes. And we still live in the best neighborhood on the planet with respect to our trade north to Canada and, as you mentioned, south to Mexico. And we've got to strengthen that. If there's ever a time to strengthen it, it's now. I'll also say that here in a year or so, we're going to have the first formal review of USMCA, and we don't want to have to go into that review with all kinds of problems.
According to USDA, Mexico is set to be the #1 ag export destination for the U.S. and will spend an estimated $28.7 billion this year alone on U.S. ag products. I'm C.J. Miller.
You are listening to the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. With today's National Spotlight, here's Gary Crawford.
This Wednesday, the USDA will issue its monthly ag supply and demand report, which will include a new survey-based winter wheat forecast. Now, for the other major crops, such as corn, rice, and soybeans, it's
a little bit too early to assume anything other than normal trend yield expectations.
That's for the production side, but USDA Outlook Board Chairman Mark Jekanowski says his analysts will be making new forecasts for the demand side of the market.
We're, always, again, continuing to monitor U.S. exports and our competitiveness of U.S. exports relative to the other major suppliers out there. And our old crop supplies are, starting to wind down, and we're starting to look ahead.
So while USDA will likely not have new production forecasts for the major spring planted crops, it will have new export and price projections this Wednesday noon Eastern Time. Corn growers have managed to get more than 95% of that crop planted, which is equal to the 5-year average.
A bit of a miracle that we have managed to stay at or ahead of that normal planting pace in the Midwest despite frequent thunderstorms.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says corn emergence is also ahead of schedule.
You have to consider that just about every week in the Midwest has been at or above average on temperatures, so what's been planted, although it's been spread out over a number of weeks, is emerging and growing for the most part. 85% corn emergence on June 9th, 1 point ahead of the 5-year average.
And how does that corn look?
Very good at this early stage.
USDA currently rates 74% of the corn crop in good to excellent condition, only 5% in poor to very poor shape, much better than a year ago when only 51% of the corn was in good to excellent condition, 8% poor to very poor. USDA says soybean producers have planted 87% of that crop. 70% of those beans have emerged already. And as to the condition of that crop, USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey told us as we start this week.
An optimistic start coming in at 72% good to excellent, 4% very poor to poor, better than last year's 59% good to excellent and 9% very poor to poor.
Now, generally, at least one state or other will have some kind of major problem with crops, but Rippey says of the 18 soybean reporting states,
not a single one at this early stage is reporting double-digit, very poor-to-poor ratings. So broadly, an even start to that. We don't even have pockets of concern at this early stage.
Of course, everybody knows things can change in farming in a hurry, so Rippey says enjoy the good times while you can. We now have the complete U.S. ag trade numbers for the first 7 months of this fiscal year, October through April, and for U.S. exports, we are at $108.8 billion. Down
5% from the previous year.
USDA economist Bart Ketter says a 5% decline for the year-to-date may sound bad, but it actually may represent a bit of an improvement. You heard him say that in April, U.S. ag exports were running 5% below same time a year ago.
In March, that number was 6% lower. February data showed a 7% decrease from the previous year, and January data showed 9% decrease. And December data showed 11% decrease. And so we've closed the gap from last year to this year by about 2% a month since December.
One possible reason for that, a cooling down of inflation that we've seen over the last 6 months. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
That's today's National Spotlight. Now here's the livestock report. Producers in participating states can enroll in a pilot program connected to continuing response to the H5N1 virus in dairy cows. Rod Bain reports.
The shape and nature of prevention and protection efforts against the H5N1 virus in dairy cattle. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack offered explanation in a recent visit with reporters.
Literally thousands of tests have been conducted and reviewed, not only of cattle, but also of milk. I'm confident that we have a good understanding of the nature of this virus in terms of how it's being transferred between and within various farms.
That understanding has facilitated USDA response to date through actions such as
the federal order that limit movement in terms of interstate movement, and it's why we've established the reimbursement rate for enhanced biosecurity and the indemnification program.
The media call came with an announcement by the Secretary of a new voluntary H5N1 dairy herd status pilot program. $824 million in Commodity Credit Corporation emergency funding is being used to implement this pilot, which
basically provides an incentive for producers, for dairy farms, to basically participate in a testing regime to allow to more freely move dairy cows across the state lines, which would be a benefit to many, many producers who are currently not impacted and affected by the virus.
Secretary Vilsack believes this pilot program and subsequent USDA response efforts to H5N1 focuses not just on dairy and poultry producers directly impacted.
And what we do know from what we have learned in terms of the recent circumstances is that there are many factors that need to be considered in terms of how this might spread. We have a responsibility and obligation to make sure we're doing everything we can to protect all farmers and all operations. I think our challenge here is to make sure that our producers are well aware, fully aware of the importance of biosecurity, not just for their own operation, but for its impact on other operations. And I think farmers all believe they have a responsibility to their neighbor and to their community and to agriculture generally.
And he hopes in the very near future
we will be outlining specifically how the indemnification process for the loss of production that may occur following a dairy cow basically recovering from the virus for a period of time, how that might operate in order to indemnify or reimburse the farmer for the losses.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Don't forget, if you've missed any of our morning shows or if you simply need to catch the news at a different time, you can subscribe to our podcast and have statewide agriculture news at your convenience. All you have to do is search for the AgNet News Hour on your favorite podcast downloading app. That's AgNet News Hour, and it's available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Coming up in a few moments, we'll have today's This Land of Ours report, but first, more of the day's agriculture news. And with today's AgNet West headlines, here's Brian German.
Legal efforts are underway challenging how probationary status is handled in regard to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Executive Director of the Kings County Farm Bureau, Dusty Ferentz, explained the legal action they've taken against the State Water Board.
Kings County Farm Bureau alone, with a couple of grower members, has filed a complaint against the State Water Resources Control Board for placing the subbasin on probation. We've identified 8 causes of action where, in our legal opinion, the state board violated law by placing us on probation. That's an effort underway. That's a big, expensive effort. And it's important for your audience to understand that the Tulare Lake Subbasin is one of several subbasins to be considered for probation. There are several probationary hearings scheduled for the rest of this year and next year, where the board will consider placing other subbasins on probation. But if we have any level of success with our challenge, that changes how the State Water Board deals with probation moving forward. This is not a Kings County issue right now. This is not a Tulare Lake Subbasin issue right now. This is a California issue. And if we're successful, some of their overreaching tactics won't be applicable in the future when they consider probation, and it'll keep them, working within the confines of the law.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture and Farm Raise have launched an online decision tool for the Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish program. The tool helps agricultural producers affected by natural disasters understand and access support. It's part of the Farm Service Agency's broader educational hub, which includes various resources and decision aids. The ELAP decision tool guides users through eligibility, application requirements, and necessary documentation, but it's not an application itself. It covers losses not addressed by other FSA programs, including those from drought, blizzards, disease, and wildfires. The tool simplifies the application process by allowing producers to segment by loss type and upload required documentation directly. Additionally, the hub features other tools like the Livestock Indemnity Program Decision Tool and several how-to videos for FSA farm loan programs. This partnership aims to improve access to USDA programs and streamline the application process for disaster relief and other assistance programs. Continuing efforts to implement sustainable practices remains a critical focus for the fertilizer industry. President and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, Corey Rosenbusch, said that it's essential to communicate these sustainable practices that growers are implementing when it comes to fertilizer use.
Priority of the fertilizer industry still continues to be sustainability and the important message that we have to tell. We're in DC and our primary focus is advocacy. And so we're expecting 2024 to be a major policy-making year that shifts from Capitol Hill to the administration. As this first term comes to an end, they're going to be looking to get a lot of things across the finish line from a policy perspective. A lot of those policies are very environmental, climate-related items that will have a big impact on fertilizer production, but also on fertilizer use.
Spotted lanternfly egg masses were discovered on a shipment from New York to Sonoma County, raising concerns within California's grape industry. The egg masses were found at the Truckee Border Protection Station in March, marking the first time that spotted lanternfly egg masses have been detected in California. The California Association of Wine Grape Growers issued a warning about the discovery, emphasizing the need for awareness because undetected egg masses could hatch, leading to adult lanternflies appearing in late summer or early fall. That could have significant repercussions for the wine grape industry as the pest feeds on grapevine sap, leaving a sticky residue and stressing the plants, sometimes causing death. Details of the intercepted shipment include finding a total of 44 egg masses on a large metal sculpture. After additional inspections and cleaning, the shipment was eventually allowed into California under strict conditions. State agencies will be hosting public workshops going over the California Climate Adaptation Strategy. Mandated by Assembly Bill 1482, the strategy links together the state's existing and planned climate adaptation efforts to advance the state's 6 climate resilience priorities. State leaders are in the middle of hosting in-person workshops that consist of a public workshop during the day and a more informal community meeting in the evening. The next event is scheduled for Thursday, June 13th at the Fresno Interdenominational Refugee Ministries beginning at 9:30 in the morning, followed by a second event at Fresno City Hall that begins at 5:30 p.m. In Oroville on June 18th, a public workshop will be held at 1 p.m. at the Southside Oroville Community Center, followed by a second community meeting beginning at 5:30. More information about the events is available at climateresilience.ca.gov. I'm Brian German for AgNet West Radio Network.
June is National Homeowners Month. That's coming up on this line of ours. President Biden has proclaimed June as National Homeowners Month. Gary Crawford has more.
Housing is so much more than just a word. It's about people's lives.
That's why President Biden has proclaimed June as Home Ownership Month. Of course, the idea is to help boost home ownership rates across the country, not just in urban centers. And in fact, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture,
we have a program here to help increase home ownership rates.
In fact, several programs. That's Joaquin Altoro. He runs the USDA's Rural Housing Service, and he says his department has been operating single-family housing, grant, and loan programs for a long time.
Actually, since 1949, USDA's single-family housing programs have actually helped nearly 5 million families and individuals, really achieve their dream of home ownership.
Today, USDA has programs to help folks buy, repair, and even build affordable homes. For details, go online to rd.usda.gov. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And I'm Sabrina Halvorson for AgNet West. You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. The recent National Congress of American Indians provided the Agriculture Secretary opportunity to discuss several of USDA's recent efforts to advance increased food sovereignty and self-determination in tribal nations. Rod Bain looks at some of these programs and projects in this edition of Agriculture USA.
A recent series of announcements by Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack are associated with USDA efforts to advance food sovereignty and economic opportunity for tribal nations. Among the issues being addressed through USDA programs,
really three things that needed to be done. There were barriers that we knew of that created a problem in terms of Indians being able to access USDA programs. We needed to better integrate indigenous knowledge into the activities at USDA and to understand and also to incorporate tribal values. And finally, the need for us over time to support more fully and transparently the notion of tribal self-determination.
I'm Rod Bain. Coming up, a look at USDA building its support of tribal food sovereignty and self-determination in this edition of Agriculture USA. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack recently participated in the 2024 National Congress of American Indians in North Carolina. It was an opportunity for the Secretary to discuss the continuing strengthening of the relationship between the Agriculture Department and tribal nations. That includes a list presented last December as part of USDA's Indian Country Accomplishments in 2023 report.
One of the first steps that's necessary is for us to understand at USDA the significant impact and intersection of activities within USDA and tribes. And one way to do that is to have a better understanding of where agriculture, where farming, where USDA's portfolio intersects with tribal needs and requirements.
Secretary Vilsack acknowledged that times and circumstances may present the challenge of how to incorporate Native American culture and customs in the scope of a broad USDA program.
It may be that we have a program that applies across the board to the entire country. And so as we work through this, it's going to be important for us to understand how to structure and how to creatively work through the challenge of self-determination from a standpoint of fitting it into a program that essentially has a broad portfolio and a broad base of people who are interested and involved in it.
Some examples of this approach were revealed through announcements of USDA programs associated with tribal food sovereignty and economic development. For instance,
we're announcing a grant of $2.3 million to 5 Native-led organizations that will help school nutrition officials across the United States better understand and appreciate the need to serve foods that are more in line with the indigenous foods that tribal communities are anxious to have incorporated in school meals.
Other announcements center on grants to expand meat processing capabilities in tribal nations for traditional game and fish such as bison, reindeer, and salmon.
We know that there are tribes that are interested to have their capacity to essentially process those foods and make them available. It creates economic opportunity, it creates jobs, and it creates better access to indigenous foods. 8 tribes receiving resources, a total of $42.5 million. This goes beyond the handful of announcements we made earlier to expand meat processing capacity, the first time that we've actually focused on indigenous meat processing.
Also revealed a new USDA internship program focused on education of tribal agricultural and food sovereignty matters.
We're providing resources to tribal colleges to provide expanded internships and fellowships. We announced 14 students who are undergrads, graduates, or even postgraduate students who will be recipients of an opportunity to be tribal policy interns. Now, this is an opportunity for us to incorporate a chance for students to come into USDA to learn a little bit about our program, to learn a little bit about USDA.
The Secretary, meanwhile, discussed a historic ag trade mission taking place later this month.
We've never had a tribal nation trade mission until now.
Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs Alexis Taylor will lead the delegation of 15 tribal and Native Hawaiian agribusinesses and 13 Native Nation ag leaders during the June 17th through 20th mission to Vancouver, British Columbia. Also in regard to tribal sovereignty, Secretary Vilsack announced intent of funding announcements for co-stewardship projects under the Tribal Forest Protection Act.
To expand on the 180 tribal co-stewardship agreements that we've entered into, we're announcing 23 projects under our co-stewardship arrangement, $18.4 million being provided to tribes.
This has been Agriculture USA. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Controlling ants around the home can be tricky business. Gary Crawford has more. Not more ants, just more information.
One of my favorite 50s science fiction movies is Them. You know, the one about the giant ants.
Is there any type of gas we can use? No, we can't take a chance. It might poison the whole city.
Which is being invaded by a slew of giant ants.
People call, like, I have an ant problem. What do I do?
I hope not that kind of ant problem, but that's Kate Chapman, extension insect expert with the University of Nebraska, and she says normal-sized ants are a big enough problem. In some cases, folks call her about outdoor ant problems, how to keep ants from showing up at a cookout or picnic, and of course, they can be there, and some people wouldn't care at all. Others might care a lot. As Kate puts it,
I think everyone has a different tolerance and a threshold. I am fine with sharing space, but my husband, on the other hand, doesn't want a single insect near him. So I think it just depends on the comfort level, too.
However, Kate says when she gets a call, by that time, it's usually from somebody with serious reservations about having ants at a picnic, whether it's 2 ants or 1,000.
You can always go the pesticide route with ants, but, ants live outdoors. That's just where they're going to be. And you can do a pesticide, but chances are they're going to come back a week later.
Some people try the various bait traps and such.
We usually only recommend those if we find them foraging inside, which is, a different issue than kind of sharing the outside space with them.
And a little more serious issue. Kate says she gets a lot of calls from people whose homes have been invaded by foraging ants, and you'd think a simple solution would be some sort of poisoned bait.
But a lot of it goes down to what type of ant problem it is. Here in Nebraska, we have a dozen different ant species, and some ant species prefer the really sugary bait traps, and some ant species won't even go near them. So if someone calls me, first thing I say is, well, we need to figure out what it is. Bring me a sample so I can look under the microscope, and then we can go from there.
She says many people come to her after searching online for so-called surefire insect control tricks. And indeed, she says, when you search for those, you'll get literally
thousands of hits that are going to tell you, oh, vinegar works, oh, cayenne pepper, cinnamon, things like that. And I just want to say, stick to the research. There are products out there that are approved, that work really well. I know people want to lean towards kind of the natural alternatives, and there are more natural products out there too. Just kind of be wary of what you're doing. That's going to be my biggest piece of advice.
Except to start by going to experts like her right off the bat. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
This is the AgNet News Hour. We'll be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. In this week's Almond Matters, brought to you by Valent USA, with warming temperatures comes additional mite pressure in orchards.
In this week's Almond Matters, brought to you by Valent USA, we're talking mite management with our friend Todd Berkdahl, Field Market Development Specialist with Valent. And now, Todd, we're here in the middle of June. We've had a couple of days of triple-digit temperatures already, so summer seems like it's here. And so what's that going to mean for pest management systems, and what to do about getting after mites?
Yeah, we've had a relatively cool spring, Brian. It wasn't as cool as last year, but things have kind of taken a jump start here in the last week with the heat. I've been looking at several blocks up and down, especially in the South Valley, and seeing mites, female mites, overwintering females, finding a few eggs here and there going back a couple, 3 weeks, but nothing that was, taken off. And with this heat, I would expect the population to explode. I don't know of a better term to call it, because the heat is what makes mites propagate the species. The physiology kicks into gear and they become very prolific. So I would say if you haven't considered checking your fields, you better check them right now. Any sign of mites, get out there and knock them out now, because with this heat, and I expect it to continue through the summer, we're middle of June now, and I would expect a good population of mites, primarily because we had a mild winter, and the overwintering population of pregnant females is, I think, is pretty high out there based on what I've seen. So getting on them early, don't wait till they explode to start shooting them, because if you do, you're going to be late. And there's a whole bunch of targets out there, so it's easier to shoot when there's just a couple of targets, knock them out, and be done with them, or at least stifle their propagation or proliferation. But if we wait, you're going to have problems, webbing and defoliation and all that, the things that mites can do to almonds. I mean, most PCAs know that they need to stay on top of mites, because if they don't, it'll make them look bad for number one. Number two, it causes, defoliation, orchard webbing is just a mess. So last year I had a couple blocks that I was monitoring or watching down in the Wasco area that literally got defoliated from mites. Well, mites and disease. There was rust and alternaria too that was problematic, but the trees were under stress, disease stress, as well as mite stress, and it looked like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree come harvest.
So getting on that now, what's going to be the best approach? I know getting out there early in the season is a preference and getting ahead of any potential problems, but where we're at now, what kind of approaches can be taken?
Well, I think one of the biggest things with miticides, I know it is with zeal because I've worked with zeal for the last 13 years. It toxazole zeal, and we have a new formulation now that's supposed to be better for coverage, zeal MVP. And I think it is. It's an EC formulation. It's safe. We've tested it across the board on almonds. Using E. Some guys are afraid of ECs, but we looked at it on grapes and almonds and a whole bunch of different other crops. Walnuts are kind of a dead horse these days, but no phyto issues with the EC formulation, even with tank mixes. So that was a good thing. But getting coverage is really, really key to controlling mites, because they're a really small pest and they can hide in the nooks and crannies, or they web over. If you allow the population to propagate and they web over the leaves, that webbing acts as a barrier to water penetration, becomes really hydrophobic as far as getting product to them. And a lot of these products, once they've dried, the residual is not that great. So getting a contact miticide on, as with Zeal MVP, getting coverage, good coverage when you make the application is really key to making the product give you the full benefit. And if you want the full benefit, you use it right and you get the full benefit. If you don't, you spray every other row or go too fast, don't get good coverage, then you compromise the efficacy of what you should be expecting. And so I always harp on coverage, because it's the number one thing I see when I go out and look. They say, hey, we sprayed and it didn't work, or what are we going to do here? I said, spray to get coverage. Okay, go slow. Speed does not kill. You've heard that from me before, but go slow as possible, and use the lowest volume of water and the slowest speed possible. Lowest volume of water that you can, so keeping a high concentration of product, but at the same time ensuring good coverage. And it maybe you can do it with 100 gallons, maybe you need 150 gallons. I don't know, but getting good coverage I cannot overemphasize the need for that, especially with miticides, with anything, with diseases too. To the degree you get coverage is to the degree you get kill. And so getting good kill with zeal makes a lot of difference.
Yeah, so basically, no matter what material you're using and how effective it normally can be, that's sort of going to be a moot point if you're not getting it where it needs to go with good coverage.
Correct. We've done bioassays with zeal, over the years to evaluate. We've used it for several years now, and there's always this thing, well, it's been used for so long, it doesn't work as well as it did. But when you put a population and subject them to the product, they die. The females lay sterile eggs, and the eggs that they have laid already, they die, and then the nymphs don't go to the next stage. So it still works very well. I think the biggest thing is maybe it worked too well back in the day, and so people got maybe a little bit lax in ensuring coverage. If you get good coverage, you get good kill. And zeal is a contact material, and several of the other products are too. But I kind of gravitate to zeal because I work for Valent. But it's a good product. You got to get good coverage, and you'll be happy with it. You get the true value out of the product, especially in economic times such as they are today. So you want to get the most bang for your buck, whatever you spray.
You are listening to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Chuck Zimmerman.
I'm visiting with Brent Kemp with Ag Gateway, and we're at the mid-year meeting for the organization. Tell us a little bit about what you wanted to let the members here know about the work that you guys are doing.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, we're here at Prairie Meadows in Altoona, Iowa, at North America's mid-year meeting, and
our mid-year meetings are always working sessions. We joke about rolling the sleeves up and just digging in. And that's really what we're all about this time, too. We've got working groups that are dealing with unique identification questions for organizations, entities, locations, growers, things like that. We've just announced version 1 for ADAPT Standard, and we're taking a look at what happens next with that. What are the plans there? We've got segment meetups that are taking place where they're identifying the next project, the next working group, and just looking forward to getting some traction for the annual conference coming up in November. It's coming faster than we sometimes think.
You know, you mentioned North America because the organization has expanded outwards. Do you see maybe a push or a time when they'll come here, or we might need to go somewhere else?
We often have representatives from Europe and Latin America at our conferences. Typically, it's at the annual conference, but Jim Wilson and I will be going to Europe's mid-year meeting next week, and Latin America has held their mid-year meeting. So we do have those regional meetings, definitely. One of the things that we've talked about is, can we share the business meeting that we're required to do as an organization and do that in a regional environment. That way, instead of having to do the budget report out, the election report out, things like that, only at the North America annual meeting, could we do that in Brazil? Could we do it in Europe? We're always looking to make sure that the organization is as inclusive as its membership, and that we're aware of and recognizing the contributions of those regions.
Well, going back to the announcement this week of ADAPT version 1.0, just how important is that to members and to Ag Gateway?
Oh, ADAPT Standard version 1 has been long in coming, and we're super excited to have that launch. One of the things that we heard with the original ADAPT toolkit over and over was, well, this isn't a standard, or it's a standard would be this. The ADAPT toolkit was never designed to be a standard. It was never intended to be one. But the question behind the question was, why can't it be? And what we've done with ADAPT Standard is taken that common format, that translation format, and disambiguated it from the software, so that now, regardless of what software you're using, what development environment you're in, what language you're using, anybody can now write to that format. And we've built a plugin to the ADAPT translation tool, the ADAPT toolkit, that can consume that. And anybody who's written a plugin for their proprietary system now can consume ADAPT format or ADAPT standard format files, and ADAPT toolkit can output ADAPT standard. We think it's going to be just a great thing for the industry.
I was in the committee meeting for a little bit here this morning and talked with one of the members about this, and the fact that there are already discussions in the committee of things that can be added to the version. Maybe it's 1.0 or 1.12 or whatever, but that's something that could be in a discussion as we get to the annual meeting, it sounds like.
Absolutely. ADAPT was always designed to be field operations centric, but not field operations exclusive. So some of the other field operations adjacent formats and data needs, like soil testing or irrigation management or something like that, that's not already considered, that may very well come up as, hey, we should put this in, or we should have a plug-in to deal with that. Yeah.
Well, just a little plug before we go of the annual meeting that will be coming up later this year.
That's right. We'll be in Austin, Texas in November. I think it's the same dates, the 10th, 11th, and 12th. I may have that off a day or two. But we're looking forward to being back in Austin. We were there in 2019, I believe, and we'll be back in Clearwater in 2025. So have those dates and locations on the calendar already.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brent. At Ag Gateway Mid-Year Meeting, I'm Chuck Zimmerman reporting.
That's today's top agriculture news. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West online at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find our broadcast team of Brian German and Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.